All right, hey there, Euro Bears. This is a no-frills recorded slideshow lecture about the United Kingdom in the early 19th century. As an overview of this whole era, we see sort of a radical change happening in the UK. When we think of England, Great Britain, the United Kingdom, throughout most of our study of European history, we think of a place where the people are a little bit more free than they are elsewhere in the continent, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. People are simply more free. And in the UK in the early 19th century, this starts to change a little bit. England, for a little while, actually becomes a full-on police state in the 1820s. So why is this? Let's get into it. The cause of this is, of course, Napoleon. And of course, after Napoleon gets kicked out of Europe, first in 1814 and then in 1815, we have the creation of the Congress of Vienna. And the purpose of the Congress of Vienna was for all the old heads of state to get together to figure out how they could maintain their old regimes and how they would support each other in maintaining a conservative structure for Europe. And even though the British representative there, Viscount Castlereagh, wasn't supportive of, well, the Holy Alliance or this system in general, we do find that Britain will have a concern with revolution developing in Britain, and the powers that be are going to do their best to stop that revolution from happening. The head of state for Britain throughout most of the early 19th century is this particular individual. He is King George IV after the year 1820, but he is the Prince Regent starting in 1811. So the previous monarch is George III. That is the monarch that we Americans fought a revolution against. He essentially goes crazy, and by the time you get to the early 19th century, he is unable to run the government. And so his son, whose name is also George, he becomes the Prince Regent and the effective head of state. And then in 1820, after his dad dies, he becomes the king. This is known as the Regency era. It was a time known for aristocratic indulgence and excess. And the Prince Regent, and then later George IV, same man again, he was not probably the greatest man to have to be king. He did not inspire a lot of the people. He loved living in luxury. He didn't really care too much about the people. So he really was not a very inspirational head of state, and he's probably remembered as one of the worst kings in British history. But we do have a constitutional monarchy, and there are two political parties that we need to revisit. There are the Whigs and the Tories, the Whigs being the Liberal Party and the Tories being the Conservative Party. Let's remember what liberal and conservative means at this point in time in the early 19th century, because it is different from what liberal and conservative means today in the 21st century. Back then, a liberal was supportive of free trade and greater enfranchisement. That means greater democracy. That means giving more people the right to vote. So in other words, if they're supportive of free trade, they are very supportive of a laissez-faire economic system. They wanted government not involved in free trade. That's a little bit different from today, where if you believed in government being hands-off with business and supporting a laissez-faire economic system, you probably would be considered conservative and not liberal. But back then, you were considered to be liberal. So back then, what did it mean to be conservative back then? Back then, to be conservative meant that you were supportive of traditional aristocratic privileges. In other words, you didn't want absolute free trade. That way the aristocrats could control their property and there could be a maintenance of a mercantilist system. The Prime Minister of Britain throughout most of the early 19th century was this man. He was Lord Liverpool, 1812 to 1827, and he was, of course, a conservative. Britain has been changing over the last about 100 years since the development of James Watt's steam engine in the middle of the 18th century. You now have greater production that's happening on the farms, better farm equipment, fewer workers needed on the farms. There is a mass migration into the cities where we have factories where steam power can be harnessed. And so people are moving from the countrysides to the cities. This is called urbanization. They are living in crowded cities and they are working in the factories. So this period of industrialization, historians like to argue about, as they look at how horrible things were for most of the workers in the urban areas and the factories. Were things truly worse in the factories than they were out in the countryside where they were peasant farmers? They were still working. There still was no concept of a vacation. They were working 12-hour days. It doesn't matter if you were pushing a plow or you were, working in a factory. You're still working these long, excruciating hours, and life was not good in either place. So, which one was actually worse? But we're in the early 19th century now. Let's put us in one of these places. This would be a textile mill, and England had incredible textile manufacturing. This would be cloth, clothing, and such. And in the early 18 teens, the textile manufacturing machines became ever more efficient. Effectively, textile machines could start doing the work of 700 men. So this is great. If you are an owner of a textile mill, you can start making a whole lot more money because you are not paying human beings for doing the work. You've got machines to do the work. But what this means is you've got 700 guys that are out on the street now. So what happens to these men who have lost all their jobs? And with greater efficiency happening in all the factories, there were no jobs to be found. These men started going hungry. They couldn't feed their families. They started getting desperate. So just put yourself in these poor men's shoes here. What would you do if you had lost your job? There's no jobs to be found, and you know that it was this machine that put you out of business, or put you out of work rather. Some of these men started joining radical groups. They called themselves frame breakers. They were later on called Luddites. And these frame breakers and these Luddites would break into the mills, and they would break the looms. They would break the machines that had taken their jobs. Sometimes they would engage in violence against other people, and they would sometimes kill factory owners. So these were the Luddites, and the riots began in 1813. Today it's worth noting that this word Luddite refers to anybody who is afraid of new technology. Somebody who doesn't like technology. So if, today in the 2020s, if you're walking around and you refuse to use maybe a cell phone, a smartphone or something like that because you think this is the demise of humanity, somebody might call you a Luddite. All right, but these Luddites back here in the 18 teens, they were a genuine threat to society. They were destroying property, they were killing people, all because they'd been driven out of their jobs. These were desperate men. I mean, what other choice did they have? But Parliament gets together and they decide to pass a law to stop these individuals. So they passed the Frame Breaking Act of the year 1812. And the Frame Breaking Act says that if you engage in an act of frame breaking, so in other words, you're a Luddite, the punishment is death. You will get executed for going into a mill with the intent of destroying any of the machinery. So this caused a little bit of a stir in Parliament, the passage of this act. There were some people who thought, well, this is just simply too harsh. These men are in dire straits. They're desperate. What other recourse did they have? We must do something to provide for these men. And one of the members of Parliament who spoke up was this particular individual. His birth name was George Byron, or George Gordon, George Gordon. But he is remembered by his aristocratic name, which is Lord Byron. At this particular point in time in history, Lord Byron is a member of Parliament, and that is all he is. He spoke out in defense of the Luddite. He gave passionate speeches. He was seen by most of the parliamentarians who do not support the Luddites as being obnoxious. And Lord Byron finds out that he is not a very good politician in terms of his persuasion, but he is a fantastic poet. Not long after this, he published his first poem, which is Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. It was an overnight success, and as Lord Byron said, I woke up one day and I was famous. Everybody wanted to invite him to dinner. He has no longer any political aspirations. He's going to continue to write poetry and begin what becomes his long, exciting, wild life. So you would think, okay, if there's all these problems with the frame breakers and the laws are against them, well, why not just change the laws? I mean, this is a democracy. It's a constitutional monarchy. But there was a problem in England. Laws couldn't really get changed that easily because of what we in America would call districting. There was in England at this point in time these districts that were called rotten boroughs. And boroughs is the British word for district. So an area, a piece of land with representatives that would go to vote and have members of parliament. So they had these rotten boroughs, which were these old, ancient, aristocratic lands in which there were few to sometimes no people living on them, but they still had representatives in parliament because they were old aristocratic lands, and there was some aristocrat that held title to this land. And there were, as the Industrial Revolution develops, these new cities that start off as these small, nothing villages like Birmingham, Leeds, and then of course the biggest one, Manchester. And they have huge populations now thanks to the Industrial Revolutions, but they don't have any members in Parliament. So all these people have absolutely no representation in Parliament. So the best example, or the one that all of us AP Euro teachers refer to as the best example of a rotten borough, is this place called Old Sarum, which was an ancient village that goes all the way back to the 11th century, the time of William the Conqueror, but it had a negligible population. It might have had no people living in it, I don't know, but a very, very small population, if any, and it still had two members of, representing Old Sarum in Parliament. And of course, these two people would be, very supportive of the aristocrats. So they'd be very conservative. And then you have Manchester and Leeds. These cities, by the time you get to the 18 teens, have a population of around 150,000 people each, but they have zero members of parliament because going all the way back to the 11th century, Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, they were know-nothing villages. They were very, very small towns, so they had no members of parliament. So there was kind of this push to redistrict England, or redistrict the entire United Kingdom, so that there would be a more fair representation in Parliament. Now, if you're an aristocrat, you don't want to change anything. But if you're one of the industrialists in the city, or especially if you're one of the men in the city, you want this to change so that you can have some representation in Parliament and maybe change the laws and make the United Kingdom a more fair place for you. The single most important law that we need to learn about is the Corn Law of 1815. This is a very conservative law that supported the aristocrats. What the Corn Law of 1815 was a protective tariff that supported British aristocrats. British aristocrats is probably the best way to think of it. So first of all, in understanding this, corn is grain. In Britain, corn is simply another word for grain. So what we're looking at here is bread. What the Corn Law did was placed a heavy tariff on any and all grain or bread that's getting imported into England. So if you had bread that was made, let's say, in Belgium or the United States, and it comes into Britain, that bread would be sold at a very high cost because of the tariff that was placed on it and coming in. What does this do? This allows for the aristocrats who have their fields of grain and who make their bread. It makes their bread the cheaper bread so that you have to buy their bread. Okay, so the aristocrats really like it. Who doesn't like it are the poor people, because the poor people are like, well, the aristocrats, they're getting all the money and they can fix their own bread prices. If we could simply have free trade and bring in grain from other countries, then we can lower the prices of bread. Bread prices become more competitive, and we can afford it a little bit better. Okay, so there was some violent reaction to this, as we see in some of these images here, where farm workers would go into the fields and destroy the crops or burn grain caches or something like that. So there was a sense that, well, now Parliament's going to have to step up and pass laws to protect the Corn Law and to protect the lands of the aristocrats. You're looking at here two particular individuals who are very much against the Corn Law of 1815. The first that you see here on the left is Henry Orator Hunt. Orator was, of course, his nickname, and yes, he was a very, very great speaker. Henry Orator Hunt was a radical reformer, but he wasn't too terribly radical. As he went around from town to town and giving speeches, his call was for universal male suffrage. He believed that if just every man in the United Kingdom had the right to vote, then we would have new laws and we would have a more fair United Kingdom. Things would be better. So this is what Henry Orator Hunt goes from town to town speaking about, and he was a very, very popular speaker. The man on the right there is far more of a radical. Arthur Thistlewood spent time in revolutionary Paris. He was very sort of instilled with Jacobin ideas. He very much believes in killing the rich and having a revolutionary government and having land reform and land redistribution. So these two men were together at a place called Spa Fields, where they got together and where they addressed a very, very large crowd in December of 1816. And at this particular meeting, they drew up a declaration calling for an end to the Corn Law and for universal male suffrage. And they took this declaration and they sent it to the Prince Regent. This would be the future George IV, King George IV. So they sent it to him. He did not respond at all. But there were riots that grew up out of this. The Prince Regent, the future George IV, he was in his carriage, and while he was riding on his carriage, a mob attacked his carriage. They threw pebbles at the carriage. One of these pebbles broke the window of his carriage. He thought it was a bullet that was being fired at him, and he thought that the people that were doing this were inspired by Henry Hunt and Arthur Thistlewood, and he felt the time had come to essentially shut this movement down, that these two people were inciting bad things to happen in England. So Parliament then, in response to this, passes the Coercive Acts of 1817. These Coercive Acts of 1817 suspended the right of habeas corpus. So in other words, the government could come if they suspected you of any type of sedition or of being a frame breaker or anything. They could take you, they could lock you up without any trial. They also placed limits on freedom of assembly. Anything that the government deemed as a seditious gathering could be shut down and people there could be arrested. So it's not a complete end to the freedom of assembly, but it limits freedom of assembly. So things come to a head 2 years later when Henry Hunt, this is Henry Orator Hunt, decides to address a group of working class men and women outside of the town of Manchester, which is, of course, the big growing industrial town. He goes to a place called St. Peter's Field. It's August 1819. He stands on a small platform and addresses a crowd, a huge crowd of 60,000 people. St. Peter's Field is about the size of 2 football fields, 60,000 people crammed in there, and Henry Hunt addresses them, and he's again calling for universal male suffrage and how they should, stand up for their rights and how they should advocate for this. Now, the thing is, this was a very, very peaceful gathering. People know that anything that is identified as seditious will be seen as they could all get locked up. So everybody showed up to this. Everybody was very quiet. Everybody was very respectful. Everybody dressed up for it. They were sort of in their Sunday best. But there were still people who disagreed with Henry Hunt. There were the aristocrats. There were people who looked at this as a threat. And they saw what was going on. I mean, it was hard to miss it. 60,000 people in this field. So they called in the police to break it up. And so the police were simply going to go in and get Henry Hunt and arrest him for doing this. When the people see the police come in to arrest Henry Hunt, they lock arms. So nobody can get through. It's sort of like a big game of Red Rover, Red Rover. Everybody's locking arms. In response to this, then, the police get horses and they go on a cavalry charge into St. Peter's Field. You can sort of see this here in this particular image. They go into the crowd, slashing their sabers right and left until they capture Henry Hunt. This is known as the Peterloo Massacre. On their rampage in, the police killed 15 people and they injured 650 people roundabout. Interestingly, the most people who were injured were women. Historical interpretation of this, why did the police go after the women? Why were they using their sabers against women? That seems so awful. It's because they thought that politics is a man's business, that women shouldn't be there at all. And so when the police went in, this sort of discriminatory attitude came out. When they started slashing their sabers around, they went after the women. The response to the Peterloo Massacre, and by the way, that term Peterloo comes from both St. Peter's Field, and it's a play on, obviously, the Battle of Waterloo. After this, the Parliament responds with something called the Six Acts. The Six Acts are 6 pieces of legislation that effectively make Britain a police state. There was a reiteration that there was to be very little freedom of assembly. Anything that was considered to be a political meeting was considered illegal, and it could be broken up. There were severe restrictions to freedom of speech and print. So you couldn't print anything that was against the government or say anything that was against the government. And there were significant restrictions on who could carry a weapon. So these are, in general, the 6 acts that make Britain a very, very conservative place. In response to this, Arthur Thistlewood decided to respond. And remember, he's a radical. He's the one who was very inspired by the Jacobins in Paris during the French Revolution. So he got a bunch of friends together, and they met on a hayloft in a street in London, where they are going to plan the assassination of every member of Parliament. They are going to kill them all. We know this today as the Cato Street Conspiracy. In the hayloft among his friends was a government spy who goes and reports this. The government comes and they raid the hayloft, they grab the guys, and they execute several of them. And so this was the end of Arthur Thistlewood. And the Cato Street Conspiracy is a little bit like Guy Fawkes in British history, this attempt to murder everybody in the British government. Okay, so we get into the late 18 teens and we go into the early 1820s, and the United Kingdom is a very conservative Tory-ruled state. But the Industrial Revolution is still on. We've still got masses of people in cities like Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, working in factories. They have very harsh lives. And there's still kind of this revolution that could happen. And so what then happens from 1820 on is you have conservative legislators. You've got Tories. But they feel the need that they should let off some steam. Otherwise, the whole thing is going to blow. So they actually pass some liberal reforms in an effort to stop revolts or even worse, a revolution from happening. So an excellent example of this is under this man, the Duke of Wellington. We've learned about him before. He's the victor of the Battle of Waterloo, the guy who defeated Napoleon. He becomes prime minister in 1827, and he is particularly concerned with an Irish revolt, that the Irish are going to rise up. They're going to kill their British masters and drive them back to Britain, free themselves. So the Duke of Wellington oversaw the 1829 Catholic Emancipation Act. In other words, it is now legal to be Catholic. So in other words, there can be Catholic representatives in Parliament. The Irish Catholic politician who pushed for this was a man by the name of Daniel O'Connell, remembered as the Liberator. He's considered to be one of the greatest Irish politicians of all time, who really put pressure on Wellington to get this resolved. That was in 1827. I'm sorry, in 1829. The following year, in 1830, there's big pressure on Britain to continue to reform. And there's several things that lead to this pressure to reform. And the first is that France has another revolution. Now, it is nowhere near as violent as the revolution that happened in 1789 through 1795, but there was a change of government. The king was driven out of France, and coincidentally, that king ran away to England. We've got a new king. We've got a constitutional monarchy in France. There was greater enfranchisement in France. So things are changing in France. And the big concern is in England that this is going to come here, that our people are going to do the same thing. So there was this sense of we've got to do something to placate the working class. but also in 1830, maybe inspired by the revolutions in France, and then maybe just inspired by the horrible conditions in the big cities in England. There were mass meetings that were happening, and it didn't matter that these were illegal; they were still happening. And there were also riots then for better representation. They wanted to get rid of the rotten boroughs. So because of all these meetings and these riots, their Parliament finally decides to respond in the year 1832. In 1832, Parliament passes the Reform Bill. So the Reform Bill of 1832 does a few things. Here they are. The first thing that it does is it redistricts the United Kingdom. So in other words, we get rid of the rotten boroughs. We're going to have representation based upon the population and where the population is living. So places like Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, they're going to have better representation in Parliament. The electorate expands to 200,000 voters. So this is how many men now have the right to vote, which you look at that number, that is still a very small number considering the entire population of Britain, but it is also double the number of voters that Britain previously had before the Reform Bill of 1832. And it allows for greater free trade. So the Corn Law is still in effect, but there is more free trade, which makes more people happy in Britain. Now, what the Reform Bill does is essentially make the industrialists, these guys now have representation. So in Britain, when the Industrial Revolution happened and you had the emergence of these entrepreneurs and very successful entrepreneurs like this man, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the aristocrats didn't know exactly what to think. I mean, this was the new money that was coming up. And the aristocrats are always very protective of their land, of their prestige, their power, and like, who are these new up-and-comers, these guys who had started off with nothing. They weren't aristocrats, and now they have more money than most aristocrats. So how do we interact with them? And what started to happen was a partnership, that the aristocrats would start supporting entrepreneurs, and actually they became some of the chief financiers and started investing in some of the entrepreneurs. But now with the Great Reform Bill of 1832, industrialists now have representation, and they're essentially on equal footing with the aristocracy. But still the majority of the people cannot vote. And so after the Reform Bill of 1832, there was a movement called the Chartist Movement that developed in Britain. The Chartist Movement is called the Chartist Movement because they believed in what they called a people's charter. And essentially what they want is for all men to have the right to vote. And so this was a movement that would continue to grow throughout the 19th century. As we head out of the 1830s and into the 1840s, it is important to know that at the end of the 1840s, we are going to have mass revolution throughout the continent of Europe. In 1848, and 1848 is a very significant year for us as students of AP European history, there are going to be nearly 50 revolutions that happen across Europe. So why is there going to be mass revolution in the year 1848? Well, part of the reason why there's going to be mass revolution is because the 1840s were a really tough time for a lot of people. Historians today call the 1840s the Hungry 40s, and a large part of the Hungry 40s was because there was throughout Europe a potato blight. Potatoes had been for a few hundred years now a staple crop, especially a crop for the poor because it grew so easily. It was such a versatile crop, and it could fill you up. Potatoes are good. We Americans know that. And so a lot of the poor people were dependent upon potatoes to eat. And in the 1840s, sadly, this potato blight knocked out the potatoes. And so people, there was starvation. And nowhere, even though this happened everywhere throughout Europe, nowhere was it worse than in Ireland. And it started in 1845. In Ireland, the Irish, who were so poor, were pretty much completely dependent upon the potato. And the potato served them well. If you had 1 acre of potatoes, that could feed 10 people for an entire year. So they grew a lot of potatoes so that they would have enough to eat. But in the year 1845, when they were pulling the potatoes out of the ground, they weren't potatoes, but they were this black mush, and there was nothing to eat. For the Irish, who were tenant farmers on the lands of English aristocrats, these Irish tenant farmers paid for their land. They paid their rent in potatoes. So they gave the potatoes to the landlord who sold them off or did whatever with them. And that's how and so when they couldn't pay their landlords with the potatoes, they were then kicked off and they were expected to just, wander around and find food. This was absolutely devastating. It led to 2 million Irish people either fleeing the country or dying. About 1 million of these people just died. And it was awful, absolutely awful starvation. And you can imagine what happens in times of desperation like this. Cannibalism happened. People were walking around like fighting each other for little scraps of food. It was very disturbing. And then over 1 million people are going to leave, and then millions more are going to continue to leave in the year following the potato blight. There are a lot of powerful firsthand accounts of the Irish potato famine of 1845 throughout the remainder of the 1840s. Here's one. I just pulled one out for us. And this is from an American woman. She was traveling around the coast of Ireland with several other Americans, and she recorded this in her journal, looking at the coast of Ireland. Nothing of life was seen or heard, except for occasionally a dog. I thoughtlessly asked, "How can the dogs look so fat and sleek when there is no food for the people?" The captain looked around at the others and asked, "Should I tell her?" Thus insinuating that there were so many dead people lying around that the dogs were scavenging human corpses to eat. This had a devastating effect on the country of Ireland. In 1840, prior to the Blight, the population of Ireland was approximately 8 million people. By the time you get to the dawn of the 20th century, the population of Ireland is 4 million people. There is just simply no hope in Ireland, and the Irish people are themselves running away. So that when you get to today, 2020, there are far more people of Irish descent who live outside of Ireland than there ever are that live in Ireland. And really, it's only been in recent years in the 21st century where there's been more immigration happening, more people coming to Ireland, and especially businesses investing in Ireland, than there have been people leaving Ireland. And this is really a recent development. So, hey, good for Ireland. But back then, where did people go? Well, the Irish, if they could flee the British Isles, they tended to go to the English-speaking world. So Australia, Canada, but most of them ended up here in the good old United States of America. Most Irish immigrants landed in the cities of New York, Boston, or Savannah, Georgia. This had an incredible impact on the culture of the United States. Nearly 15 years later, our country is in the middle of a civil war, and there was a particular battle, the Battle of Fredericksburg, which is in Virginia, in December of 1862. This was just a battle of historical irony. On both sides, the army were made up of almost exclusively Irishmen. So this wasn't really North versus South. This was Irish versus Irish. But there's obviously been a lot of impact of Ireland on American culture, everything from sports teams to, there's even some small towns in central Ohio named after Irish towns, which are awful. But there is the impact of the Irish on American culture. If you were fleeing Ireland in the 1840s, here's how you would go. You'd get to Dublin. Dublin was your ticket out if you could get to Dublin. When you got to Dublin, if you could, you would get on a boat that would sail you from Dublin across the Irish Sea to Liverpool, to the port city of Liverpool. The boats that carried you from Dublin to Liverpool tended to be called coffin ships because people died en route. And then if you go from Liverpool, most people just ended up in Liverpool. They just stayed in Britain because they couldn't afford to get on a boat to travel all the way to like New York or Boston. So they were stuck in Liverpool, and Liverpool started to divide because the British didn't really like the Irish. So there was, one side of the River Mersey, which was mostly English, and the other side, which was mostly Irish. And but of all the people, the millions that fled from Ireland to Liverpool, I find it interesting to always mention that two of them were named John O'Lennon and James McCartney II. So hopefully some of you know where I'm going with this. These are two ancestors of the Beatles, and the Beatles started in the city of Liverpool. So we can make the argument that the Beatles were also a result of the Irish potato famine of the 1840s. Now, Britain has to respond to the Irish potato famine. They didn't do a whole lot to help the Irish, but they did do this. The Corn Laws get repealed in the year 1846, 1 year into the Irish potato famine. So with this now, grain and bread can be imported into the British Isles, and lowering the price of bread so as to help the people out a little bit. But with the Great Reform Bill of 1832 and with the Corn Laws repealed in 1846, England is now more free trade. So the aristocratic privileges are ending in terms of business. And Parliament will continue to protect free trade all the way up until the First World War. Still, only a limited number of men can vote in England or throughout the United Kingdom. And so the Chartist movement will continue to push for universal male suffrage. And again, for right here, I just want to accentuate they are pushing for universal male suffrage, not women. So what about the women? Or rather, why not the women? Well, the Chartist movement was a very macho movement. They were men who worked in factories. And sort of their image was that you should give these men the right to work because these are the real men. These are the guys who are at the looms. These are the guys who work so hard and live in squalor in the city. These are the guys who are making all this money for England, and they're men. They're the macho guys who work in the factories. And so they honestly didn't include women because they thought it was bad for their image. So women took matters into their own hands, and when you get to the late 19th century, you have the emergence in England of a suffragist movement, women asking for suffrage or the right to vote. So we'll see more of the suffragist movement in the late 19th century, and Eurobears, that is all. Hopefully you've got a good sense of what life was like in the United Kingdom throughout the early part of the 19th century, how they go from being a country with a lot of freedoms relative to the rest of the continent to themselves becoming a very conservative state in response to the Napoleonic Wars. That's it. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. I'll see you in class, guys.